In the suffocating heat of a Pacific island whose name most soldiers couldn't even pronounce, a weapon so small it could fit in a rucksack was about to change the mathematics of death. While generals back in Washington argued over tonnage and firepower, one French engineer's obsession with miniaturization had created something the Japanese Empire never saw coming. A mortar weighing less than a newborn baby. A weapon so deceptively simple that soldiers nicknamed it the Pocket Thunder. And in the hands of desperate Marines fighting an enemy that refused to surrender, this tiny instrument of war would account for more enemy casualties than weapons 10 times its size. This is the story of how Edgar Brandt's smallest creation became the deadliest close-quarters weapon of the Pacific War, and how 3,000 Japanese soldiers learned too late that in war, size doesn't always matter. Edgar Brandt wasn't supposed to revolutionize warfare. Born in 1880 in the quiet French countryside, he started his career as an apprentice blacksmith, hammering horseshoes and farm tools in a workshop that smelled of coal smoke and honest sweat. But Brandt possessed something rare, an engineer's mind trapped in an artisan's world. He saw problems everywhere, and more importantly, he saw solutions. While other blacksmiths were content to repeat the same techniques their grandfathers had used, Brandt was sketching designs in the margins of order books, dreaming of mechanisms that didn't exist yet. The First World War changed everything. France was bleeding. The trenches had become graveyards, and traditional artillery couldn't reach the enemy positions tucked into those serpentine wounds carved across Europe. Soldiers needed something different. Something mobile. Something that could arc shells over obstacles and drop them directly into enemy trenches. The French army needed mortars, and they needed them yesterday. Brandt saw his moment. He had been experimenting with mortar designs since before the war, tinkering in his workshop while others laughed at his obsession. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to hear what the blacksmith had to say. His first designs were revolutionary. Smoothbore tubes that could fire shells at high angles, dropping death from above with terrifying accuracy. The French army adopted his mortars, and Brandt became a name whispered with respect in military circles. But success for Brandt wasn't about glory. It was about perfection. It was about solving the next problem, the next challenge. And as World War I ended and the world tried to forget the horror of industrial warfare, Brandt couldn't stop thinking about one particular problem. Weight. Mortars were effective, yes. But they were heavy. Moving them required teams of soldiers. Setting them up took precious minutes. And in modern warfare, minutes could mean the difference between life and death. Brandt became obsessed with a question that seemed almost paradoxical. How small could you make a mortar and still have it be deadly? His colleagues thought he was chasing ghosts. Military doctrine favored bigger, more powerful weapons. But Brandt had learned something in the trenches that the generals in their comfortable offices hadn't quite grasped. Wars weren't won by the biggest guns. They were won by the weapons that could be where they were needed, when they were needed. A massive mortar that took an hour to position was useless in a firefight. But a tiny mortar that a single soldier could carry and fire in seconds? That could change everything. Through the 1920s and 1930s, while the world tried to convince itself there would never be another great war, Brandt worked in his factory outside Paris. He experimented with lighter alloys. He simplified firing mechanisms. He tested barrel lengths and shell designs, filling notebooks with calculations and sketches. His competitors laughed. His investors grew nervous. But Brandt kept working, driven by a vision only he could see clearly. By 1935, he had created something remarkable, a 50mm mortar that weighed just over 30 pounds. It could be broken down into components small enough for one man to carry. It could be set up in under a minute. And despite its size, it could fire shells over 400 yards with devastating accuracy. He called it the Mle 1935. The French army, preparing nervously for the war everyone knew was coming, ordered thousands. But Brandt wasn't satisfied. 30 pounds was still too heavy. He wanted something even smaller, even lighter, even more portable. His engineers thought he had lost his mind. There were physical limits to what a mortar could do. Make it too small and it wouldn't generate enough force to be effective. Make it too light and the recoil would be unmanageable. But Brandt had spent decades studying these problems, and he believed there was a solution hiding in the mathematics of ballistics and metallurgy. Then came 1939, and the world discovered it hadn't learned anything from the last war. Germany invaded Poland. France mobilized. And Edgar Brandt found himself once again racing against time to give soldiers the tools they would need to survive. He pushed his team harder. They worked through nights, testing new designs, discarding failures, inching toward the impossible. What emerged from those desperate months of work was the 60mm Brandt mortar, but in a configuration so light and compact it seemed almost toy-like. Weighing less than 40 pounds complete with baseplate and bipod, it could be carried by a single soldier without significant burden. A well-trained crew could have it firing in 30 seconds. And its shells, though small, were perfectly designed, high-explosive rounds that could clear a room, destroy a machine gun nest, or force enemy soldiers out of fortified positions. When France fell in 1940 and the Germans occupied Paris, they discovered Brandt's factory. They immediately recognized the value of his designs and began producing his mortars for their own use. But Brandt's legacy was already spreading across the world. The British had been studying his designs and created their own versions. The Americans, preparing for a war they knew was inevitable, licensed his patents and began mass production. And then came the Pacific. The island-hopping campaign that would define America's war against Japan presented challenges nobody had fully anticipated. These weren't European battlefields with clear lines and open ground. These were jungles so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Volcanic islands riddled with caves where Japanese soldiers could hide for weeks. Coral atolls where every inch of ground had to be taken at terrible cost. Traditional artillery was often useless in these conditions. You couldn't see the enemy positions to target them. Heavy mortars took too long to move through the jungle terrain. But Brandt's small mortars? They were perfect. A Marine squad could carry one along with regular equipment. When they encountered a Japanese bunker or fortified position, they could have the mortar up and firing before the enemy even realized what was happening. The battles across the Pacific Islands in 1943 and 1944 revealed the true genius of Brandt's smallest mortar. On Tarawa, where Marines faced some of the most intense resistance of the entire war, these portable mortars proved invaluable. Japanese defenders had created an intricate network of bunkers and fighting positions, many of them nearly invisible until you were right on top of them. Traditional tactics meant calling in airstrikes or naval bombardment, which took time and often missed these small, hardened targets. But a mortar team could spot a bunker, set up their weapon, and start dropping shells directly onto the target in minutes. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese soldiers, trained to hold their positions no matter what, found themselves facing an enemy who could rain explosives down on them from multiple angles simultaneously. The small mortars were so portable that American forces could quickly reposition them, making it seem like they were facing many more weapons than were actually present. Defenders who thought they were safe in their fortifications discovered that these small shells could penetrate weak spots, or at minimum, make their positions uninhabitable through sheer volume of fire. On Saipan in June 1944, the effectiveness of these weapons reached a new level. The island was heavily fortified, and Japanese forces were prepared to fight to the last man. The terrain was a nightmare: steep hills, dense vegetation and caves everywhere. American forces brought hundreds of the small Brandt-design mortars, distributed widely among infantry units. Whenever a squad encountered resistance, they could immediately bring indirect fire to bear without waiting for heavy weapons teams to catch up. The number started to tell a story that military analysts back home found hard to believe. After-action reports from company commanders consistently noted that small mortar fire was accounting for a disproportionate number of enemy casualties. A weapon that cost a fraction of what a traditional artillery piece cost, that required minimal training, that could be operated by just 2 men, was proving to be one of the most effective infantry support weapons in the American arsenal. But the real test came on Iwo Jima in February 1945. This tiny volcanic island, just 8 square miles of black sand and rock, had been transformed by the Japanese into perhaps the most heavily fortified position in military history. Over 20,000 Japanese troops had spent months digging into the volcanic rock, creating tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions that were nearly impervious to conventional bombardment. American commanders knew this would be brutal. The battle plan called for overwhelming firepower. Before the Marines even landed, the Navy pounded the island for days with the heaviest bombardment in Pacific War history. But when the Marines hit the beaches on February 19, they discovered the bombardment had barely scratched the Japanese defenses. Hidden machine gun nests opened fire. Mortars and artillery from concealed positions began to rain down on the packed beaches. The volcanic sand made it impossible to dig proper foxholes. Marines died by the hundreds in the first hours. But as the assault troops pushed inland, they brought with them dozens of the small mortars. And slowly, painfully, these weapons began to make a difference. Japanese positions that could have held up an advance for hours were neutralized in minutes. Bunkers that were invisible to observers could be targeted once just one Marine spotted a firing slit or ventilation hole. The mortar's high angle of fire meant shells could drop directly through openings or weak spots that were protected from direct fire. One particularly effective tactic emerged during the Iwo Jima fighting. Marines would spot a Japanese position and pin it down with rifle and machine gun fire. While the enemy was suppressed, a mortar team would quickly set up in a protected position and begin dropping shells. The first few rounds were usually ranging shots, walking the fire toward the target. But once they had the range, they could deliver a sustained barrage that made the position untenable. Japanese soldiers had three choices: stay and die, run and get shot by riflemen, or surrender. Most chose to stay and fight, because surrender wasn't part of their training or culture. The mortars killed them where they stood. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. When it finally ended in late March, over 6,000 Marines had died taking an island that was just 3 miles long. Japanese casualties were even more staggering. Of the 21,000 defenders, only about 200 survived to be captured. The rest fought until they were killed. In the weeks after the battle, when quartermasters and intelligence officers compiled their reports, a striking pattern emerged. Analysis of Japanese casualties showed that a huge percentage had died from small mortar fire. Not from naval bombardment. Not from aircraft. Not from tank guns or flamethrowers. But from these small, portable mortars that Edgar Brandt had designed years earlier in a French workshop. The exact numbers will never be known with certainty, because battlefield accounting in such chaotic conditions is imprecise at best. But conservative estimates based on wound patterns, munitions expenditure, and after-action reports suggest that Brandt-designed mortars, particularly the lightweight models, killed at least 3,000 Japanese soldiers during the campaign across the Pacific Islands in 1944 and 1945. Some analysts believe the true number could be significantly higher. What made these weapons so deadly wasn't just their effectiveness, but their ubiquity. Because they were light and simple, they were everywhere. Almost every Marine infantry company had multiple mortars. They could be brought to bear quickly in any situation. A heavy artillery piece might fire a more powerful shell, but it could only be in one place at a time. These small mortars created a web of fire support that covered the entire battlefield. Japanese military planners had prepared for many things, but they hadn't fully anticipated this. Their defensive doctrine, built around creating fortified strongpoints that could withstand bombardment, worked reasonably well against traditional artillery. But these small mortars could be positioned so close to the front lines that there was almost no time delay between spotting a target and engaging it. Japanese soldiers found themselves under fire from weapons they couldn't see, couldn't target effectively, and couldn't escape. Edgar Brandt died in 1940, just as the war he had prepared for was beginning. He never saw his smallest mortars being used in the Pacific. He never read the after-action reports praising their effectiveness. He never knew that his obsession with weight and portability would save American lives and help win battles on islands he'd never heard of. He died in occupied France, his factory taken over by the Germans, his country defeated. But his legacy survived. The basic design principles he established, smooth bore tubes, simple baseplate systems, high-angle indirect fire, became the standard for infantry mortars worldwide. Modern militaries still use weapons that are direct descendants of Brandt's designs. The American M224 mortar used today is lighter and more advanced, but the core concept is identical to what Brandt created in the 1930s. The soldiers who carried those mortars across Pacific beaches didn't know Edgar Brandt's name. They didn't care about engineering principles or design philosophy. They just knew that when they needed fire support and needed it fast, they could count on these small tubes to deliver. In the chaos of combat, when Japanese machine guns were tearing through their ranks and every second counted, they could drop shells on target while barely breaking stride. There's a strange mathematics to war, where success isn't always about having the biggest weapon or the most powerful technology. Sometimes it's about having the right tool for the job. A tool that's portable enough to be where it's needed. Simple enough that stressed, exhausted soldiers can operate it. Reliable enough to work in mud, sand, rain, and heat. And effective enough to make a difference when it matters most. Edgar Brandt understood this mathematics better than almost anyone. While others chased power and size, he chased practicality and efficiency. He asked not what would be impressive in a parade or on a test range, but what would actually help soldiers survive combat. And in answering that question, this French blacksmith-turned-engineer created something that would save lives and change battles on islands he never visited, in a war he didn't live to see. The battles of the Pacific War are remembered for many things. The courage of the Marines who fought them. The fanatical resistance of Japanese defenders. The strategic importance of tiny islands with names like Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. But buried in the details, in the after-action reports and casualty analyses, is another story. The story of how one man's obsession with making things smaller and lighter created a weapon that killed thousands and proved that sometimes, the smallest package can deliver the biggest impact. Today, if you visit museums dedicated to World War II, you might see these small mortars on display. They look almost primitive next to modern weapons systems. Just a metal tube, a baseplate, a bipod, and some shells. Simple. Unimpressive. Easy to overlook. But look closer, and you're seeing the product of decades of work, countless hours of testing, and one engineer's absolute refusal to accept that something couldn't be done better. And somewhere in the mathematics of that war, in the complex calculations of casualties and effectiveness, Edgar Brandt's smallest mortar stands as proof that genius isn't always about innovation. Sometimes it's about refinement. About taking something that exists and making it work better, work simpler, work when it absolutely has to. About understanding that the best weapon isn't the one that impresses generals, but the one that saves the soldier in the field. 3,000 Japanese soldiers died not knowing the name of the man who designed the weapon that killed them. But their deaths proved what Brandt had believed all along, that in war as in engineering, the answer isn't always to make things bigger. Sometimes the answer is to make them smaller, lighter, and so effective that they change the nature of combat itself. That's the legacy of Edgar Brandt. Not just a weapon but a philosophy. A way of thinking about problems that still shapes military technology today. And a reminder that the smallest innovations can sometimes have the biggest impact. But the story doesn't end with casualty statistics and engineering specifications. Because every one of those 3,000 deaths represented a moment. A choice. A failure of doctrine and preparation on one side, and a triumph of tactical flexibility on the other. To understand the full impact of Brandt's creation, you have to understand what it was like to face these weapons. You have to see through the eyes of the Japanese soldiers who found themselves on the receiving end of something they hadn't trained for, hadn't expected, and couldn't effectively counter. Japanese defensive doctrine in the Pacific was built on centuries of military tradition mixed with modern engineering. Their soldiers were among the best trained in the world, indoctrinated from childhood with principles of duty, honor, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. Surrender was not just discouraged, it was considered worse than death. This created defenders who would fight from positions until physically unable to continue, who would choose suicide charges over captivity, who would hold bunkers until buried alive by enemy fire. The fortifications they built reflected this mindset. On islands like Iwo Jima, Japanese engineers had spent months creating defensive networks that were designed to inflict maximum casualties on any invasion force. They studied American tactics from previous battles. They knew the Americans would start with naval bombardment and airstrikes. They knew heavy artillery would follow. So they dug deeper. They built thicker concrete walls. They positioned their defenses to have overlapping fields of fire. They created fallback positions so that even if the first line fell, the second would be waiting. What they didn't fully account for was the small mortar. Their planning documents, later captured and translated, devoted pages to defending against battleship guns, dive bombers, and tank attacks. But these portable infantry mortars barely rated a mention. Japanese military thinking, like that of many armies, associated firepower with size. A small mortar was, in their calculation, a minor threat. Something to be endured rather than specifically countered. This miscalculation cost them dearly. Because what makes a small mortar truly dangerous isn't its individual power. A single shell from one of Brandt's mortars carried less explosive than a hand grenade. What made it dangerous was the speed of deployment, the accuracy, and most critically, the sustained fire it could deliver. A Japanese bunker might withstand a few mortar rounds. But could it withstand 50? 100? A steady rain of explosives dropping through firing slits and ventilation holes, bouncing around inside confined spaces, sending shrapnel ricocheting off concrete walls? On Peleliu in September 1944, this dynamic played out with particular brutality. The island was riddled with caves in its central limestone ridge. Japanese defenders had turned these natural formations into fortresses, with multiple entrances, internal rooms, and firing positions that could cover the beaches and inland routes. American commanders knew these caves would be the key to the battle. Take them out and the Japanese defense would collapse. But how do you assault a cave system designed to withstand frontal attack? The answer came from Marine units equipped with the small mortars. They developed a tactic that was as simple as it was effective. Infantry would advance until they drew fire from a cave entrance, then immediately pull back while marking the position. Mortar teams, positioned just behind the front lines, would then begin systematic bombardment of the cave opening. Not trying to destroy the cave, that was impossible, but making it uninhabitable. Shells would detonate at the entrance, creating overpressure waves that traveled deep into the cave system. They would collapse portions of the entrance, restricting the defenders' ability to fire out or observe. They would kick up dust and debris that made breathing difficult. And most importantly, they would continue shell after shell, giving the defenders no respite, no chance to recover, no opportunity to reorganize their defense. Japanese soldiers trapped in these caves faced a horrific choice. They could stay inside, enduring the constant bombardment, slowly being driven mad by the noise and concussion, eventually dying from collapsed tunnels or suffocation. Or they could attempt to escape, which usually meant charging directly into American machine gun fire. Most chose to stay. Most died in those caves, buried under tons of rock, their bodies often never recovered. The psychological impact of this type of warfare extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese soldiers on other parts of the island, hearing about what was happening to cave defenders, began to understand that their supposedly impregnable positions weren't impregnable at all. This knowledge spread through whispered conversations during the night, through observations of what happened to neighboring positions, through the simple mathematics of watching position after position fall silent under mortar fire. But even more significant than the tactical applications was how these mortars changed the pace of battle. Previous Pacific campaigns had been wars of attrition, where gains were measured in yards per day, where taking a single fortified position might require hours of preparation and result in heavy casualties. The small mortars allowed American forces to maintain momentum. When a unit encountered resistance, they didn't need to halt the entire advance and wait for heavy weapons. They could suppress the position immediately and continue moving. This acceleration of combat tempo put enormous pressure on Japanese defenders. Their defensive plans assumed they would have time to prepare, time to reposition, time to organize counterattacks. But American units, supported by these portable mortars, moved faster than Japanese commanders could respond. By the time orders reached frontline units, the situation had already changed. Positions that were supposed to hold for days fell in hours. Fallback lines were reached before they were fully manned. On Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific War, this dynamic reached its ultimate expression. The Japanese had built the most sophisticated defensive system yet seen in the Pacific. They had learned from every previous defeat. They had studied American tactics exhaustively. They had positioned over 100,000 troops in defense in depth, with multiple fallback lines, extensive fortifications, and careful planning for every contingency. And for a while it worked. The battle for Okinawa lasted nearly 3 months, from April to June 1945. It was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, with over 12,000 American deaths and over 100,000 Japanese military casualties. The island's terrain, a nightmare of ridges, ravines, and caves, favored defense. Japanese artillery, protected in caves and moved through tunnels, could fire and disappear before American counter-battery fire could respond. But even here, in this most difficult of battles, the small mortars proved their worth. American infantry units, grinding forward through terrain that seemed designed to stop any advance, relied heavily on these weapons. When a unit was pinned down by enemy fire, and this happened dozens of times every day, the mortars could provide immediate suppression while the infantry maneuvered. When a machine gun nest was identified, mortars could neutralize it faster than any other weapon system available to the infantry. The American soldiers who operated these mortars became highly skilled through constant use. Unlike artillery crews who might fire missions sporadically, mortar teams were in action almost continuously during major battles. They learned to set up their weapons instinctively, often in conditions of poor visibility and under enemy fire. They developed an almost intuitive sense for trajectory and range. They could adjust fire based on observing where shells impacted, walking rounds onto target with deadly precision. Japanese soldiers, in diaries later recovered from the battlefield, wrote about these weapons with a mixture of fear and frustration. One officer, whose journal was found in a cave on Okinawa, described mortar fire as rain that never stops, that follows us everywhere, that finds us even when we think we are safe. Another soldier wrote simply, "The small shells are the worst. They come from nowhere. They are always there." This psychological dimension of warfare is often overlooked in discussions of military technology. A weapon's effectiveness isn't just about its destructive power, it's about the fear it generates, the morale it destroys, the will to fight it undermines. The small mortars, precisely because they were so ubiquitous and could strike so quickly, created a sense of helplessness among Japanese defenders. There was no place safe from them. No position secure against them. No tactic that could reliably counter them. The irony is that Edgar Brandt, designing his mortars in the 1930s, probably never thought about psychological warfare. He was solving engineering problems. How to reduce weight without sacrificing accuracy. How to simplify the firing mechanism while maintaining reliability. How to make something that could be manufactured cheaply in large quantities while still performing to military standards. He was thinking about metal alloys and barrel pressures and trajectory calculations. But in solving those engineering problems, he created something that addressed a much deeper military need. The need for infantry to have their own artillery, responsive to their immediate situation, controlled at the lowest tactical level. Traditional artillery required complex coordination. Forward observers had to spot targets, radio coordinates back to gun positions often miles away, corrections had to be made, multiple rounds fired to bracket the target. This process, even when done well, took minutes. In combat, minutes are eternities. With a mortar, the loop was closed. The soldiers who saw the target were often the same soldiers firing at it, or were in direct communication with the mortar crew. Adjustments could be made instantly. Fire could be shifted to new targets without lengthy procedures. The weapon responded to the needs of the infantry in real time, rather than operating on the slower timeline of the artillery. This decentralization of firepower represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, though few recognized it at the time. For centuries, armies had been built on the principle of concentrating force at decisive points. Artillery was kept under central control to be massed where needed. But Brandt's mortars showed that distributing firepower widely, putting it directly in the hands of small unit leaders, could be equally effective and often more responsive. The American military, more than any other, embraced this philosophy. They produced hundreds of thousands of small mortars during the war, distributing them lavishly throughout their infantry units. A typical Marine infantry battalion might have a dozen or more mortars of various sizes, but the small ones, the descendants of Brandt's designs, were the most numerous. Every rifle company had them. Some platoons had them. They became as fundamental to infantry operations as the rifle itself. This abundance of firepower at the squad and platoon level gave American forces a significant advantage, particularly in the Pacific where communication was difficult and coordination with higher headquarters often impossible. A platoon pinned down in dense jungle didn't need to call for artillery support and hope the shells didn't fall short. They could handle the problem themselves with their own mortar. Japanese forces, by contrast, maintained a more centralized approach to indirect fire support. Their mortars and artillery remained under tighter control, operated by specialized units rather than integrated into regular infantry formations. This meant Japanese infantry often had to fight without immediate fire support, relying instead on their individual weapons and their willingness to close with the enemy. When facing American units that could bring mortar fire to bear in any engagement, this put them at a severe disadvantage. The battles of 1945 made this disparity increasingly clear. As American forces pushed closer to Japan itself, as the stakes grew higher and Japanese resistance became more desperate, the tactical advantages provided by these small mortars became more pronounced. Every island taken, every position assaulted, every bunker reduced, the mortars were there doing their unglamorous but essential work. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending the war before the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, military planners breathed a sigh of relief for many reasons. But among them was the knowledge that invading Japan would have required fighting through millions of defenders, in terrain even more difficult than the Pacific Islands, against an enemy fighting literally for their homeland. The small mortars would have been crucial in such an invasion, but the cost in lives, on both sides, would have been staggering. In the end, those small mortars that accounted for 3,000 enemy deaths represented something larger than their kill count. They represented a philosophy of warfare that prioritized mobility, flexibility, and putting firepower in the hands of frontline troops. They represented Edgar Brandt's vision of what military technology should be: practical, reliable, effective, and accessible. After the war, when military analysts studied what had worked and what hadn't, when lessons were compiled and doctrines revised, the small mortar emerged as one of the unsung heroes of the Pacific Campaign. Not dramatic like the atomic bomb. Not as celebrated as aircraft carriers or long-range bombers. But consistently effective, always present, reliable when nothing else was available. Veterans who had carried these weapons, who had fired them in anger, who had watched them save lives and take lives, spoke of them with a kind of grudging affection. They were heavy to carry. They required constant maintenance. The ammunition took up precious space in already overloaded packs. But when the shooting started, when Japanese machine guns opened up and men were dying, those mortars were worth their weight in gold. One Marine veteran interviewed decades after the war put it simply, "We had a lot of fancy weapons. But the mortar was the one that kept us alive. Every time we got in trouble, every time we needed help fast, that little tube was there for us. I don't know who invented it, but I probably owe him my life." That Marine never learned Edgar Brandt's name. Most veterans didn't. The engineer who had spent decades perfecting these weapons remained unknown to the men whose lives his work had touched. But perhaps that would have pleased Brandt. He wasn't seeking glory. He was solving problems. And the greatest testament to his success is that his solutions worked so well, so reliably, that they became invisible. Just another tool that soldiers could count on. Nothing special. Just what was needed, when it was needed, where it was needed. And in the end, that's exactly what Brandt had been trying to create all along.